Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Sarah Mitchell looked like any other 28-year-old woman walking home from her evening shift at the hospital. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her ponytail messy, and exhaustion painted shadows under her eyes. To the three men following her through the empty parking garage, she appeared to be the perfect victim. They had no idea they were about to meet someone who could kill them with her bare hands in 17 different ways. What happened next in that dimly lit garage would be caught on security cameras and shared millions of times across social media. But the real story isn't just about those few minutes of violence. It's about the woman who spent years being told she wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't worth believing in. And how she transformed that pain into something so powerful that when danger finally found her, she was ready. This is the story of how Sarah Mitchell went from being the girl everyone called useless to becoming someone who could strike back like a Navy SEAL. Because sometimes, the people who try to break you end up creating exactly what they feared most. Sarah Mitchell's childhood home sat on the wrong side of Millfield Avenue, where the paint peeled off houses like old scabs and dreams went to die. At 8 years old, she already knew the sound of her father's boots on the stairs meant trouble was coming. Heavy footsteps after midnight usually meant he'd lost another job, spent another paycheck at Murphy's Bar, and was looking for someone to blame. Her older brother Jake got most of the attention, good and bad. He was the golden boy who could throw a perfect spiral and charm teachers with his smile. Sarah learned early to become invisible, sliding under beds and into closets when the yelling started. But invisibility only worked until it didn't. The first time her father called her useless, Sarah was 10 years old. She'd brought home a report card full of A's, excited to show someone who might care. Instead, she found him sprawled on the couch, empty beer bottles creating a fortress around his anger. "Look, Dad," she whispered, holding up the paper like a peace offering. "I got all A's again." He squinted at the report card through bloodshot eyes, then laughed. A sound like glass breaking. "Useless. All those A's and you're still the most useless thing in this house. Can't even make me a sandwich without burning the bread." The words hit harder than his fists ever did. At least when he hit her, the pain eventually stopped. But useless burrowed deep, setting up camp in her chest where it would whisper to her for years to come. School became Sarah's refuge, though even there, safety was temporary. She excelled in every subject, desperate to prove her father wrong, but success made her a target. Other kids sensed her desperation, her need to be perfect, and they circled like predators around wounded prey. Look at the bookworm they'd taunt during lunch. Thinks she's so smart but can't even afford new shoes. Sarah would look down at her worn sneakers, held together with duct tape and determination, and feel the familiar burn of shame in her cheeks. She wanted to fight back, wanted to scream that intelligence mattered more than expensive clothes, but the words never came. Instead, she swallowed her anger and buried her nose deeper in whatever book she was reading. The breaking point came during her sophomore year of high school. Sarah had been selected to represent her school in the state science fair, an honor that should have been celebrated. Instead, she came home to find her father in one of his darker moods, the kind that meant someone was going to pay for whatever disappointment life had served him that day. "Where's my dinner?" he growled as she walked through the door, science project carefully balanced in her arms. "I'll make it right now," Sarah said quickly, setting her project on the kitchen table. "I just need to put this somewhere safe first." Her father's eyes locked onto the carefully constructed model volcano she'd spent weeks perfecting. Something shifted in his expression, something cruel and calculating. "What's that piece of junk?" "It's for the state science fair. I got selected to represent our school." Pride crept into her voice despite her better judgment. He stood up slowly, swaying slightly, and Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd seen that look before, right before he destroyed Jake's football trophies during one of his rages. "State science fair," he repeated mockingly. "Look at you, thinking you're something special, thinking you're better than this family." "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Sarah said quickly. "I just worked really hard on this project." "Hard work?" he spat. "You want to know about hard work? Try working construction for 30 years just to watch your boss give you a promotion to some college kid who doesn't know a hammer from a screwdriver." Sarah could smell the alcohol on his breath as he moved closer to her project. Every instinct screamed at her to grab it and run, but she was frozen by years of conditioning that told her to stay quiet, stay small, don't make it worse. "Please don't," she whispered as his hand reached for the delicate structure. "Please don't what?" His voice was dangerously quiet now. "Please don't show you what the real world is like?" Please don't teach you that all your fancy book learning doesn't mean anything when life decides to knock you down. The volcano exploded against the kitchen wall in a shower of papier-mâché and broken dreams. Weeks of careful work, hours of research, dreams of college scholarships, all of it scattered across the linoleum floor like confetti at a funeral. Sarah stared at the wreckage, something fundamental shifting inside her chest. For years, she'd absorbed his cruelty, internalized his disappointment, carried his failures like stones in her backpack. But standing there, looking at the destruction of something she'd created with her own hands, something beautiful and meaningful, a different voice started speaking. It was quiet at first, barely a whisper against the roar of his continued verbal assault, but it was there, growing stronger with each harsh word he threw at her. "You're nothing," he was saying, enjoying the devastation in her eyes. "You'll always be nothing. Just like your mother was nothing before she was smart enough to leave this dump." The mention of her mother, who died when Sarah was 6, lit something on fire inside her. The whisper became a roar. "No," she said quietly. Her father stopped mid-sentence, surprised by the interruption. In 16 years, Sarah had never once talked back to him. "What did you say?"
I said no.
Sarah's voice was steadier now, drawing strength from some deep well she didn't know existed. "I'm not nothing, and you don't get to decide what I am anymore." The slap came fast and hard, snapping her head to the side and filling her mouth with the metallic taste of blood. But instead of crumpling, instead of apologizing and cleaning up the mess like she always did, Sarah straightened up and looked him directly in the eyes. "Is that all you've got?" Something in her tone, some new quality he'd never heard before, made him take a step back. For just a moment, confusion replaced the anger in his eyes. Sarah bent down and began collecting pieces of her destroyed project, her movements deliberate and calm despite the storm raging inside her. As she worked, she spoke in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere outside herself. "I'm going to rebuild this," she said, not looking up from the debris. "And when I win the state fair, I'm going to use the scholarship money to get as far away from you as possible. And then I'm going to become someone you could never even imagine." Her father opened his mouth to respond, probably to knock her down with more cruel words. But something in her posture stopped him. Sarah had spent years curled in on herself, making herself small and apologetic. But the girl kneeling on the kitchen floor, carefully gathering the pieces of her broken dreams, looked different. She looked dangerous. That night, after her father had passed out on the couch, Sarah sat in her bedroom with tape and glue, carefully reconstructing her volcano. As she worked, she made a list in her head of everything she needed to do to escape. Good grades weren't enough. She needed to be exceptional. She needed scholarships, recommendations, a plan that couldn't be destroyed by one man's cruelty. But more than that, she needed to become strong in ways that went beyond academic achievement. She needed to make sure that no one could ever make her feel small again. The next morning, Sarah walked into the guidance counselor's office with her rebuilt volcano and a new request. Along with her regular classes, she wanted to sign up for every self-defense class the community center offered. She wanted to learn martial arts, weapons training, survival skills, anything that would transform her from victim to victor. Mrs. Inger Henderson, the guidance counselor, looked concerned. "Sarah, these classes are quite intensive. Are you sure you want to add this to your already heavy course load?" Sarah thought about her father's shocked expression when she'd stood up to him. The moment when the balance of power had shifted ever so slightly in her favor. She thought about all the years she'd spent believing she was useless, worthless, nothing. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "I need to learn how to fight." What Mrs. Henderson didn't understand was that Sarah wasn't just talking about learning self-defense techniques. She was declaring war on every person who had ever tried to make her feel small, starting with the voice in her own head that still whispered useless during her darkest moments. The transformation didn't happen overnight. The first martial arts class nearly killed her. She was weak from years of poor nutrition and zero physical training. Her classmates were mostly men who'd been training for years, and they didn't hesitate to let her know she didn't belong. "Maybe try yoga instead," suggested one particularly arrogant brown belt, after Sarah had spent 10 minutes struggling with a basic kata. "This might be a little too intense for someone like you." Code for weak, for female, for not good enough. Sarah tasted blood in her mouth from where she'd bitten her tongue, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stayed after class to practice, running through the movements again and again until muscle memory began to replace conscious thought. Her sensei, Master Lu, was a quiet man in his 60s who'd immigrated from China decades earlier. He watched Sarah's extra practice sessions without comment for weeks before finally approaching her. "Why do you train so hard?" he asked one evening as Sarah practiced kicks against the heavy bag, her shins screaming in protest. Sarah paused, sweat dripping from her forehead. The honest answer was complicated: revenge, transformation, the desperate need to never feel powerless again. But she settled for something simpler. "Because I have to," she said. Master Liu nodded as if this explained everything. "Good reason. The students who train because they have to, they become different fighters than the ones who train because they want to. One fights for glory. The other fights for survival." Over the following months, Sarah threw herself into training with the same obsessive focus she'd once reserved for academics. She learned Muay Thai, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Krav Maga, boxing, collecting fighting techniques like other teenagers collected music or clothes. Her body began to change. Lean muscle replacing soft curves, calluses replacing tender skin. But the real transformation was happening in her mind. Every time she successfully defended against an attack in sparring, every time she managed to flip a partner twice her size, every time she pushed through exhaustion to complete another set, the voice that whispered useless grew a little quieter. Her grades never suffered. If anything, the physical training seemed to sharpen her mental focus. She maintained her 4.0 GPA while training 6 days a week, often going straight from the dojo to her part-time job at the hospital, where she worked as an aide to help pay for her classes. It was at the hospital that Sarah first glimpsed her future. She watched the nurses move through their shifts with quiet competence, handling emergencies with calm professionalism. These were people who saved lives, who made a difference, who were anything but useless. When she turned 18, she applied to nursing school with the same determination she brought to everything else. The state science fair came and went. Sarah won first place and earned a partial scholarship to State University. Her father wasn't there to see her accept the award. He'd moved out 6 months earlier, after Jake finally grew big enough to fight back, and threw him through their front window. The house felt different without his angry presence. Lighter somehow, but the damage he'd done to Sarah's psyche took longer to heal than the physical mess he'd left behind. College was a revelation. For the first time in her life, Sarah was surrounded by people who valued intelligence, who celebrated academic achievement instead of mocking it. She joined the campus martial arts club and discovered that her reputation had preceded her. Word had spread about the small-town girl who could take down men twice her size, but even success couldn't completely silence the doubts that had been programmed into her during those formative years. When she struggled with organic chemistry, the old voice returned. "See? You're not as smart as you pretended to be." When she lost a particularly brutal sparring match, it whispered, "All that training and you're still weak." The breakthrough came during her junior year, when Sarah was selected for a special program that placed nursing students in high-stress emergency situations to test their capabilities under pressure. The final exam was a simulation so realistic that several students had panic attacks and dropped out of the program entirely. Sarah was assigned to a mock mass casualty event, a staged car accident with multiple victims, professional actors screaming and bleeding, smoke machines creating chaos and confusion. Her job was to triage the wounded, prioritizing care based on who could be saved and who was beyond help. As she moved through the simulation, something clicked into place. All her years of training, academic and physical, mental and emotional, converged into a state of calm, focused competence. She assessed injuries with clinical precision, made difficult decisions without hesitation, coordinated with other responders like she'd been doing it for years. When the exercise ended, the instructor approached her with an expression Sarah had never seen directed at her before, respect tinged with something approaching awe. "Where did you learn to work under pressure like that?" he asked. Sarah thought about her father's rages, the years of walking on eggshells, the constant state of hypervigilance that had defined her childhood. She thought about sparring sessions where one mistake could mean a broken nose, about pushing her body past its limits night after night in training. "I've had practice," she said simply. After graduation, Sarah was recruited by City General Hospital, one of the most demanding emergency departments in the state. Her reputation as someone who stayed calm under pressure, who could handle anything thrown at her, spread quickly among the staff. Within 2 years, she was being considered for leadership positions typically reserved for nurses with decades of experience. But Sarah's real education was happening outside the hospital walls. She continued training in martial arts, expanding her skills to include weapons training, tactical medicine, survival techniques. She attended seminars taught by former military personnel, learning skills that went far beyond civilian self-defense. When people asked why she trained so hard, why she pushed herself so relentlessly, Sarah had difficulty explaining. How could she tell them about the 8-year-old girl who'd learned to become invisible? How could she describe the feeling of watching your dreams literally shattered against a kitchen wall? How could she make them understand that strength wasn't just about physical capability? It was about rewriting the story someone else had written for you. By her 28th birthday, Sarah had become exactly what she'd promised herself she would be. Someone her father could never have imagined. She was respected at work, feared in the dojo, and completely self-sufficient. She owned her own apartment, drove a reliable car, and had enough money saved to handle any emergency. But more importantly, she'd developed something that couldn't be bought or taught, an unshakable confidence in her own capabilities. The girl who'd once believed she was useless had been replaced by a woman who knew, with absolute certainty, that she could handle whatever life threw at her. She just didn't know how soon that confidence would be tested. The emergency department at City General had been unusually brutal that Tuesday evening. Sarah had worked a double shift, covering for a colleague whose daughter had been hospitalized with pneumonia. By the time she finally clocked out at 11:47 p.m., she felt like she'd been hit by a truck carrying other trucks. Her scrubs were stained with blood from a motorcycle accident victim, coffee from her rushed dinner break, and various other fluids she preferred not to identify. Her feet ached in her comfortable sneakers, and all she wanted was to go home, take a hot shower, and fall into bed for 6 hours before her next shift started. The parking garage beneath City General was well lit during the day, but at midnight it transformed into something altogether different. Fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, creating pools of harsh white light separated by deep shadows. Sarah's footsteps echoed off concrete walls as she made her way toward her Honda Civic, parked on level B3 in the spot she'd claimed as her own over the past 2 years. She was exhausted, but not careless. Years of training had made situational awareness second nature, and she automatically scanned her surroundings as she walked. The garage appeared empty except for her car and a few others belonging to night shift workers. Her keys were already in her hand, positioned between her fingers in the grip Master Liu had taught her years ago, not for offense, but for quick access to her vehicle. Sarah was 20 feet from her car when she heard the first set of footsteps. They were trying to be quiet, but concrete and tile don't absorb sound well, and Sarah's hearing had been sharpened by years of listening for threats. One person she assessed walking with deliberate care, but lacking the natural stealth of someone truly trained in covert movement. Amateur. She slowed her pace slightly, using the reflection in a car window to check behind her. A man in dark clothing, average height and build, keeping distance but definitely following. Her pulse increased, but not from panic, from the same focused alertness that came over her during particularly challenging sparring sessions. Sarah reached her car and made a show of fumbling with her keys while actually activating the unlock button on her key fob. The interior lights came on, illuminating the immediate area and potentially discouraging whatever her follower had planned. She opened the driver's door and tossed her purse onto the passenger seat, positioning herself so she could see the entire garage while appearing to focus on getting into her vehicle. That's when she heard the second set of footsteps. This person was moving with more confidence, less concern about noise. Sarah's mind began calculating angles and distances automatically. 2 threats, approaching from her 7 o'clock and 10 o'clock positions. They were coordinating their approach, which suggested this wasn't a random mugging. They'd planned this. A third set of footsteps emerged from behind a concrete pillar to her right. Sarah's blood chilled, not from fear but from the cold clarity that came with confirmed danger. 3 attackers meant this was serious. Random muggers worked alone or in pairs. 3 suggested organized intent, possibly worse than robbery. Sarah slid into her driver's seat but left the door open, engine running. To an observer, she looked like someone tired and oblivious, gathering her things before heading home. In reality, she was assessing weapons, calculating escape routes, and mentally reviewing every technique that might be relevant to the developing situation. The first man, the one who'd been following her initially, spoke from about 15 feet away. "Hey, nurse lady," he called out, voice artificially friendly. "Got a minute?" Sarah looked up as if surprised, playing the role of unsuspecting victim while noting everything she could about her opponents. The speaker was in his 30s, wearing jeans and a dark hoodie with the kind of nervous energy that suggested either drugs or adrenaline. His hands were visible and empty, but that didn't mean much. The second man had moved to position himself between Sarah and the garage exit, cutting off her most obvious escape route. He was older, maybe mid-40s, with the build of someone who'd once been athletic but had let beer and sedentary living soften his edges. His stance suggested some familiarity with fighting, probably recreational boxing or high school wrestling. The third man worried her the most. He positioned himself where he could approach from her blind spot, and he moved with the kind of deliberate quiet that came from practice. Military or law enforcement background, she guessed, though possibly not recent. His hands were also empty, but he kept them positioned where they could reach concealed weapons quickly. "I don't have any money," Sarah said, injecting just the right amount of nervous trembling into her voice. It wasn't entirely acting. Her heart was pounding, flooding her system with adrenaline and sharpening her focus to crystal clarity. "Who said anything about money?" the first man asked, taking 2 steps closer. "We just want to talk." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Carjacking seemed unlikely. Her Honda wasn't worth the risk of assaulting someone in a hospital parking garage. Sexual assault was more probable, but something about their coordinated approach suggested this might be even more specific than that. "Look, I just want to go home," she said, standing up slowly with her hands visible. "I've had a really long day." "Yeah, we know," said the man by the exit. "We've been watching you. You work here every Tuesday and Thursday night, leave around midnight, always park in the same spot. Very predictable." The casual way he mentioned surveillance sent ice through Sarah's veins. This wasn't random. They'd specifically targeted her. But why? She ran through mental lists of patients she'd treated, wondering if she'd somehow made enemies in the ER. Healthcare workers occasionally faced retaliation from people who blamed them for bad outcomes, but this felt different. "Watching me?" she asked, continuing the confused victim act while shifting her weight slightly, preparing for movement. "Why would you be watching me?" "Your boyfriend owes some people money," the third man said, speaking for the first time. His voice carried authority. This was their leader. "A lot of money. And he seems to think disappearing will make his problems go away." And Sarah's confusion was genuine now. "Boyfriend? I don't have a boyfriend." Marcus Williams, the leader continued. Lives on Elm Street. Drives a blue Camaro. Has that scar on his chin from when he got glassed at Riley's bar 3 years ago. Marcus Williams, she'd gone on exactly 3 dates with him 6 months ago before deciding he wasn't relationship material. He'd been charming enough, but there was something unstable about him, something that reminded her uncomfortably of her father's unpredictable moods. She'd ended things politely but firmly and hadn't spoken to him since. "I went on a few dates with Marcus half a year ago," Sarah said carefully. "But we're not together. I haven't talked to him in months." "That's not how he tells it," the first man said with an ugly smile. "According to Marcus, you two are practically engaged." Been bragging all over town about his nurse girlfriend with the steady paycheck. Sarah's heart sank as she understood. Marcus had been using her reputation, her job, her perceived financial stability as collateral for whatever deals he'd made with these people. In his desperation, he'd painted her as someone significant in his life, someone who might be willing to pay his debts. "Even if we were together, which we're not, I wouldn't be responsible for his debts," Sarah said, trying to project calm reasonableness while her mind worked furiously on tactical solutions. "See, that's where you're wrong," the leader said, moving closer. "Marcus owes $50,000 to some very serious people, money he borrowed against future earnings that aren't materializing. When someone puts up collateral they don't actually own, that becomes theft. And theft has consequences." Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that these men hadn't come to collect money. They'd come to send a message. Marcus had used her name and reputation as backing for loans he couldn't repay, and now these collectors intended to hurt her as a way of hurting him. Whether she paid or not was irrelevant. They needed Marcus to understand that his lies had real consequences. "You seem like a nice girl," the leader continued, his tone almost gentle. "Work hard, help people, probably never hurt anyone in your life. It's a shame Marcus dragged you into this, but business is business." The first man reached into his jacket, and Sarah saw the handle of a knife emerge. Not a weapon meant for intimidation. This was a serious blade, designed for serious work. The casual way he held it suggested familiarity with violence. Sarah made a decision that would have surprised her younger self, but felt as natural as breathing to the woman she'd become. Instead of pleading or trying to reason with them, instead of offering money she didn't owe, or begging for mercy she wouldn't receive, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, or a nervous smile, or any of the expressions these men were probably used to seeing on victims' faces. It was the smile of someone who'd just realized the other players in the game had seriously underestimated what they were dealing with. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said, her voice losing all traces of fear. "Marcus never was very good at reading people." The change in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Her posture straightened, her breathing deepened, and something predatory entered her eyes. Years of training had taught her to recognize the moment when conflict became inevitable, and once that line was crossed, hesitation became the enemy. If he'd been better at it, she continued conversationally, he might have realized that the quiet girl who never talked about her hobbies might have been hiding something interesting. The man with the knife frowned, sensing a shift in dynamics but not understanding what had changed. Look, lady, you can drop the tough act. This doesn't have to be complicated. Sarah laughed, and the sound made all three men tense unconsciously. It was the laugh of someone genuinely amused by a private joke. You're absolutely right, she said. It doesn't have to be complicated at all. What happened next would be analyzed by police investigators, hospital security consultants, and self-defense instructors for months afterward. The parking garage's security cameras captured everything from multiple angles, creating a record that would eventually go viral and turn Sarah Mitchell into an internet legend. But in the moment, as Sarah shifted her weight and prepared to introduce three criminals to a level of violence they hadn't imagined possible, all she could think about was 8-year-old Sarah being called useless, 16-year-old Sarah watching her dreams shattered against a kitchen wall, and every person who'd ever tried to make her feel small and powerless. The man with the knife took a step forward, still believing he was in control of the situation. Sarah let him come, cataloguing the distance between them, the angle of his approach, the way he held his weapon. Amateur, she thought again. He was gripping the handle too tightly, telegraphing his intentions with his body language, approaching in a straight line that would make him predictable. Behind him, his two partners were moving to flank her, but they were taking their time, confident that one knife-wielding man could handle one tired nurse. Their casual approach to what they assumed would be easy intimidation was about to become a fatal miscalculation. Sarah's years of training hadn't just taught her how to fight, they'd taught her how to read violence, how to identify the exact moment when talking stopped and action began. She could see that moment approaching like a storm on the horizon, and she was ready for it. The knife came up, catching the fluorescent light and throwing reflections across the concrete walls. The man holding it opened his mouth to say something, probably another threat meant to cow her into submission. He never got the chance to speak. Sarah moved with fluid precision, her body responding to years of conditioning and thousands of hours of practice. The exhaustion she'd felt moments earlier disappeared, replaced by the focused energy that came with mortal danger. Every technique she'd ever learned, every sparring session she'd survived, every moment of pain and growth and transformation had led to this. The three men who'd come to teach a lesson to a helpless nurse were about to discover they'd cornered something far more dangerous than they'd bargained for. And Sarah Mitchell, who'd spent her entire life being underestimated, was about to show them exactly what a mistake that could be. The knife sliced through the air where Sarah's torso had been a split second earlier, but she was already moving. Years of Muay Thai training had taught her that the most dangerous place to be was directly in front of an armed opponent, so she stepped laterally, while simultaneously grabbing the attacker's wrist with both hands. The man's eyes widened in shock, as his intended victim became his controller. Sarah twisted his wrist inward while stepping behind his extended arm, a textbook disarming technique she'd practiced thousands of times. The knife clattered to the concrete floor, as physics and leverage overcame whatever grip strength he possessed. But Sarah wasn't finished with him. Still holding his twisted arm, she drove her knee into his exposed ribs with enough force to lift him off his feet. The sickening crack of breaking bones echoed through the parking garage, followed immediately by a scream that sounded more animal than human. The man collapsed to his knees, clutching his side and gasping for air. The entire exchange took less than 3 seconds. The other two attackers stood frozen for a moment, their brains struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. The quiet nurse they'd come to intimidate had just destroyed their armed partner with casual efficiency. But these were experienced criminals, and their shock lasted only as long as it took them to realize they were now facing a serious threat. The leader recovered first, reaching inside his jacket for what Sarah assumed would be another weapon. She couldn't allow him to arm himself, which meant she had to close distance fast. Sarah launched herself across the 15 feet separating them with the explosive speed that came from years of sprint training and plyometric exercises. The leader managed to get his hand on what turned out to be a gun. But drawing a weapon while someone was already inside your effective range was a mistake that cost precious milliseconds. Sarah reached him before the pistol cleared his jacket, driving her shoulder into his solar plexus and wrapping her arms around his waist in a technique borrowed from her wrestling training. The impact drove both of them backward into a concrete pillar. The leader's head snapped back against the unforgiving surface with a sound like a watermelon dropping onto pavement. His eyes rolled back and his knees buckled, but Sarah held him up long enough to deliver a sharp elbow strike to the side of his neck. targeting the cluster of nerves that would ensure he stayed unconscious. 2 down. The third attacker had finally overcome his shock and was rushing toward her, but his approach lacked any technique or strategy. This was simple rage-fueled charging, the kind of emotional response that got people hurt in fights. Sarah sidestepped his clumsy grab attempt and used his momentum against him, executing a perfect hip toss that sent him sprawling across the hood of a nearby car. The sound of his body hitting metal reverberated through the garage like a gunshot. The man rolled off the hood and hit the ground hard, but he was tougher than his partners and managed to get back to his feet. Blood streamed from his nose, and there was fury in his eyes, the kind of wounded pride that made dangerous men even more unpredictable. "You think you're tough," he snarled, wiping blood from his face. "I've been fighting since before you were born, little girl." Instead, she picked up the knife that had been dropped earlier, testing its weight and balance with the familiarity of someone who'd trained extensively in weapons combat. The blade was cheap steel, poorly balanced, but sharp enough to do damage in the right hands. The man's confidence wavered when he saw how comfortably she handled the weapon. This wasn't some desperate civilian who'd gotten lucky. This was someone who actually knew how to fight. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. "You're going to sit down against that pillar and wait for the police. If you try to run, I'll hamstring you with this knife and you'll never walk normally again. If you try to fight me, I'll demonstrate some techniques they don't teach in community self-defense classes." The man looked around the garage, taking in his unconscious partners and the small woman who'd destroyed them both. Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of odds that any experienced criminal learned to do automatically. "You got lucky," he said finally, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Lucky?" Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you call 15 years of martial arts training? 4 different black belts? Weekly sparring sessions against men twice my size?" She took a step forward, and the man instinctively backed away. "You know what I call lucky?" Sarah continued. "Lucky is that I've spent the last 2 years working in trauma surgery, learning exactly how much damage a human body can take before it stops working permanently. Lucky is that I know precisely where to cut to disable without killing." The man's face had gone pale. Whatever bravado had carried him through years of criminal activity was crumbling in the face of someone who spoke about violence with clinical detachment. "Sit down," Sarah commanded, and this time he obeyed without argument. With all 3 attackers neutralized, Sarah allowed herself a moment to assess the situation. The first man was still conscious but curled in a fetal position, clutching his broken ribs and making small whimpering sounds. The leader was unconscious against the pillar, breathing but unresponsive. The third man sat where she'd ordered him, holding his broken nose and staring at her with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed 911, keeping the knife in her other hand and her eyes on her prisoners. "This is Sarah Mitchell. I'm in the parking garage at City General Hospital, level B3. I need police and paramedics. I was attacked by 3 men and had to defend myself. All 3 attackers are down and secured." The 911 operator began asking questions, but Sarah's attention was caught by movement from the unconscious leader. His hand was twitching toward his jacket, where the gun he'd never managed to draw was still concealed. Sarah moved quickly, kneeling beside him and removing a .38 revolver from his shoulder holster. She checked the weapon automatically, loaded, safety off, ready to fire. This hadn't been an intimidation piece. This had been a tool meant for serious work. Ma'am, are you there?" The 911 operator was saying. "I'm here," Sarah replied, backing away from the unconscious man while keeping the revolver pointed safely toward the ground. "The situation is under control, but one of the attackers was armed with a handgun. I've secured the weapon." "Are you injured, ma'am?" Sarah did a quick physical inventory. Her knuckles were scraped from the initial disarming technique, and she'd have bruises tomorrow from the impact when she tackled the leader, but nothing serious.
"No injuries," she reported.
"But the attackers will need medical attention. Possible broken ribs, concussion, and broken nose." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spend the next few hours treating the same men who'd come to hurt her. Police arrived first, followed closely by paramedics from the same hospital where Sarah worked. The responding officers were initially confused by the scene they encountered. A small woman in nurse's scrubs, completely calm and composed, standing over 3 large men in various states of injury and consciousness. Detective Ray Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the police force, had seen enough crime scenes to know when something didn't fit standard patterns. 3 armed men attacking a single woman should have resulted in a very different outcome than what he was looking at. "Walk me through what happened," he said to Sarah after she had been read her rights. A standard procedure even when someone appeared to be defending themselves. Sarah gave a clear, concise account of events, sticking to facts and avoiding editorial commentary. As she spoke, Detective Morrison found himself revising his assumptions about the woman in front of him. Her description of the fight was delivered with the kind of technical precision usually heard from trained security professionals, not civilians. "You said you disarmed the first attacker and broke his ribs with a knee strike," Morrison said. "Where did you learn to do that?" "I've been studying martial arts since I was 16, Sarah replied. "Multiple disciplines. I also work as a trauma nurse, so I understand human anatomy pretty well." The detective nodded, making notes. The hospital's security cameras had recorded everything, so Sarah's account could be verified, but her calm demeanor and technical knowledge were painting a picture that made sense of the seemingly impossible outcome. "These men claim they were trying to collect a debt from your boyfriend," Morrison continued. "Ex-boyfriend," Sarah corrected. "Someone I went on 3 dates with 6 months ago. Apparently he's been telling people we're in a serious relationship and using my name as collateral for loans." The detective's expression darkened. Identity fraud combined with targeting innocent parties for debt collection was a serious escalation in criminal behavior. "We'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement," Morrison said. "But based on what I'm seeing here and what the cameras show, this looks like a clear case of self-defense." As the paramedics worked on the injured attackers, Sarah found herself in the surreal position of providing medical advice for treating injuries she'd inflicted. The man with broken ribs needed x-rays to check for lung puncture. The unconscious leader showed signs of concussion and would need neurological monitoring. "You did this?" asked Janet, one of the paramedics Sarah worked with regularly. "They attacked me," Sarah said simply. Janet looked at the destruction scattered around the parking garage. 3 grown men who'd come hunting for an easy victim and found something entirely different.
"Remind me never to make you angry," Janet said, with a mixture of admiration and concern.
The story might have ended there, with 3 criminals arrested and a nurse who'd successfully defended herself, but the parking garage's security cameras had captured everything in high definition, and within hours, edited footage of the fight was spreading across social media. The video showed a tired woman in scrubs being approached by 3 threatening men. It showed the moment when her demeanor changed from victim to predator. It showed techniques executed with textbook precision, and it showed 3 armed attackers being systematically dismantled by someone they'd seriously underestimated. The internet fell in love with Sarah Mitchell immediately. Comments poured in from around the world. Military veterans recognized the tactical precision of her movements. Martial artists analyzed her techniques frame by frame. Women shared stories of their own experiences with harassment and assault, expressing vicarious satisfaction at seeing someone fight back so effectively. But the response that meant the most to Sarah came from an unexpected source. Marcus Williams, the ex-boyfriend whose lies had started the whole mess, turned himself in to police the next day. He confessed to using Sarah's name fraudulently and provided information that led to arrests throughout an organized lending operation that had been terrorizing people for months. "I saw the video," he told Detective Morrison during his confession. "I realized that Sarah could have been killed because of something I did, because I was too much of a coward to face my own problems." Marcus received a plea deal in exchange for his cooperation, but more importantly, his testimony helped authorities shut down a criminal enterprise that had been hurting people throughout the city. Sarah returned to work at City General the following week to find herself something of a celebrity among the staff. Doctors who'd barely acknowledged her before stopped to ask about her training. Nurses wanted to know if she'd teach self-defense classes. Security guards treated her with newfound respect. But the real change was in how Sarah saw herself. For years, she'd carried the voice of an angry father who'd called her useless. Even after all her achievements, after proving herself again and again, that voice had never completely disappeared. It had whispered during difficult surgeries, during challenging training sessions, during moments of doubt and uncertainty. The voice was quiet now. Standing in that parking garage, facing down 3 men who'd intended to hurt her, Sarah had finally answered the question that had haunted her since childhood. What are you worth? The answer, delivered through broken ribs and unconscious attackers, was simple. More than anyone who tries to hurt you can handle. Sarah continued working as a nurse, continued training in martial arts, continued living her life with the quiet competence that had always defined her. But something fundamental had shifted. The girl who'd once made herself invisible to avoid her father's rage had been replaced by a woman who understood her own power. She still received messages from around the world, from women who'd been inspired by her story to take self-defense classes, to stand up to abusers, to refuse to accept useless as a definition of their worth. Each message reminded Sarah that her transformation hadn't ended in that parking garage. It had just reached a new phase. The 3 men who'd attacked her were convicted and sentenced to prison terms that would keep them away from innocent people for years to come. The criminal organization they'd worked for was dismantled, protecting countless future victims from the violence that had been planned for them. Sarah kept the newspaper clipping about their convictions, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that the scared little girl who'd watched her science project destroyed had grown into someone who could protect not just herself, but others who faced similar threats. She framed it and hung it next to her nursing degree, her martial arts certificates, and a photo of her rebuilt volcano from high school. All evidence of the same truth, that being called useless by someone else doesn't make it true, and that the most dangerous person in any room might just be the one everyone underestimates. Sarah Mitchell had learned that lesson the hard way. 3 criminals in a parking garage had learnt it the harder way. And somewhere in the world, other quiet girls who'd been told they were nothing were watching the security footage and beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were capable of becoming something extraordinary.